Welcome to a Sober Shepherds podcast. My name is David Weitz. You know, the other day I was listening to a conversation and someone used a phrase that just stopped me in my tracks. They called the internet a marketplace of outrage. Once that phrase gets into your head, you start noticing it everywhere. Because if you open your phone right now, it doesn't matter whether it's Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, or the comments section under some news article. You'll see the same thing playing out over and over again. People arguing, people reacting, people picking sides, people posting things that are carefully designed to provoke the strongest emotional reaction possible. Not reflection, reaction. And that's not an accident. Anger moves at the speed of gasoline hitting a flame. One spark and suddenly the whole thing lights up. Reflection, on the other hand, moves slowly. Reflection asks people to pause, to breathe, to consider that maybe the world is a little more complicated than a headline or a meme. And the internet figured out a long time ago which one of these two things keep people engaged. Outrage keeps people clicking. Outrage keeps people commenting. Outrage keeps people scrolling, refreshing, and coming back for more. So naturally, the platforms leaned on it. Not because they're evil masterminds sitting in a control room somewhere, but because outrage works. It drives traffic. It drives engagement. It drives attention. And once something proves that it can hold attention, it becomes valuable. That's how you end up with something that starts to look less like a conversation and more like a marketplace. A marketplace of outrage. Now here's the interesting part for me personally. I've been on Facebook since 2008. That's long enough that if you scroll back far enough on my page, you can practically see the different versions of me that existed over the years, different chapters of my life, frozen in little time capsules of pictures. But one thing you're not going to find are political rants. You're not going to find posts telling people to copy and paste something or I'll unfriend them. You're not going to find me screaming into the void about whatever the crisis of the day happens to be. And that's not because I'm some perfectly calm, spiritually enlightened human being who floats through life above the chaos. Trust me, I'm not. When I first got sober, I was a mess. And I don't mean a poetic Instagram version of a mess. I mean the real thing. Angry, loud, raw, completely out of control at times. There were meetings where I lost my temper so badly, people had to escort me out of the meeting. There were meetings where people literally tried to vote me out of the room because they didn't know what to do with me. And if I'm being honest about it today, looking back with a little more humility, I probably deserved it. Early sobriety isn't pretty. It's ugly. It's chaotic. Sometimes it's a grown man sitting in a folding chair with a head full of anger and absolutely no idea what to do with it. That was me. But here's the strange thing I started noticing even during those years when I was still learning how to exist without alcohol and drugs. When I left those meetings, when I went home and opened up Facebook, I never brought that rage there. The rooms were where I worked out my anger. Social media was where I shared my life. And that distinction always mattered to me because the rooms were my safe space. That's where you bring your mess. That's where you say all the things you're still trying to figure out. That's where you admit the thoughts you're not proud of. Recovery rooms are built for that kind of honesty. But the internet? The internet isn't a safe space. The internet is a public square. It's more like the middle of a crowded city intersection where everybody is shouting through a megaphone at the same time. And if you want to be heard in that environment, the temptation is to shout louder than the person next to you. And that's exactly what we're seeing today. The volume keeps rising. Everyone reacting. Everybody responding. Everyone trying to be heard above the noise. And sometimes the same people who speak beautifully about patience, humility, and compassion in one space step into that public square and suddenly become part of the outrage economy, just like everybody else. Now listen carefully, because this part really matters. I'm not calling anyone out here. Because the truth is, we're human. Maybe when we share in a meeting, we're speaking from the best versions of ourselves. Maybe we are sitting in a moment of clarity, a moment of humility, a moment where we authentically feel connected to something bigger than our own ego. But then later that night, we're sitting on the couch, scrolling through our phone, and something pops up that hits an emotional nerve. A headline, a comment, a political post, something that pokes the exact spot where frustration or anger is already living inside us. And instead of pausing, we react. That's human. But here's the difference. The internet doesn't just allow that reaction. It rewards it. In fact, it depends on it. Because calm reflection doesn't travel nearly as fast as outrage. Anger spreads. Outrage multiplies. But reflection moves slowly. And slow things rarely go viral. That's part of the reason Sober Shepherds probably grows the way it does. Because I refuse to sell outrage. I refuse to scream into my phone. I refuse to build an audience by feeding the anger that already exists in the world. Could things grow faster if I did? Probably. But that's not what this space was ever meant to be. Sober Shepherds was never meant to be a place where people come to argue. It's meant to be a place where people come to think, to pause, to reflect, to recognize themselves in someone else's story, and maybe walk away with a little more understanding than they had before they pressed play. Recovery taught me something very simple. Pause before you react. Think before you speak. And keep in mind, that person on the other side of the conversation is just another human being trying to figure out life the same way you are. The internet might be a marketplace of outrage, but that doesn't mean we have to participate in that marketplace. We still get to choose what we sell. And maybe more importantly, we also get to choose what we refuse to buy. But here's the question that kept following me around after I wrote all that down. What if the thing we keep buying isn't just outrage? What if outrage is one shelf in a much bigger store? Or better yet, what if it's the one storefront in a mall of hundreds of other addictions? A storefront so big, it's the size of planet Earth. Because that's what life starts to look like once you've been around recovery long enough. You begin to realize that when drugs and alcohol leave the picture, the wiring that drove them doesn't just pack up its suitcase and disappear. It stays. It waits. It adapts. It starts walking corridors looking for other stores to wander into. And every store in that mall is selling the same thing in a different package. Relief, not healing. Temporary relief. Fast relief. Relief with bright lights in the windows and music playing at the door. One store selling gambling. Another sells relationships. Another sells sex. Another sells political outrage, where people get drunk on being right. Another sells compulsive shopping, where a cardboard box on the front porch becomes the modern version of anticipation. Another sells vanity, the perfect photo of a broken interior, image, status, the newest car in the parking lot, followers, likes. Different stores, same cashier, same wiring, same old craving to feel different for a little while. And I know this wiring because I've been down this dark road before. I'm not standing on the outside of this thing with a clipboard and a whistle pretending I'm a mall cop in recovery. I know what it's like to wake up with a hangover that didn't come from a bottle. I know what it's like to feel that same stale film on the soul that somehow carry the same exact sickness underneath them. Not what did I drink last night, but what did I say online? Not who did I hurt, but what did I buy that I didn't need? Not where did I end up and who am I next to? But why am I suddenly entangled with somebody I barely know who just got sober? Same hangover, same spiritual headache, same feeling of having fed something that was never going to be full in the first place. That's the part people don't like talking about, especially in recovery spaces, because it ruins the clean little storyline. We love a story with a tidy ending. I drank, I used drugs, I got sober, now everybody clap. And listen, I'm not mocking sobriety chips or anniversary celebrations. They matter. Milestones matter. Survival matters. There were years when I needed those rooms just to keep the walls from caving in. But there's a strange silence around addictions that don't come with a coin. Where I recover, there's no chip for gambling. No anniversary medallion for not turning recovery into a dating app. No applause for spending yourself into debt trying to build an image that says, look how well I'm doing. No one calls your name to the front of the room because you managed not to feed your ego for 12 consecutive months. And because there's no acknowledgement for those things, they hide better. They grow in the dark like mold behind a clean wall. From the street, the house looks fine. Fresh paint, nice shutters, beautiful flowers out front. But behind the drywall, something is spreading. That's what a lot of substitute addictions look like. Respectable on the outside, busy on the outside, spiritual on the outside. Meanwhile, the same old sickness is moving through the studs. And I've been around long enough to see the pattern. You probably have too. The person who always seems to be at the center of everything. The person with the big orbit. The person with the most sponsees, the most opinions, the most parking lot gravity. The sponsor surrounded by pigeons. And I don't mean that as a throwaway line. I mean it exactly the way it sounds. You could feel it when you see it. That little kingdom forming in the corner, that subtle performance of importance, that unspoken belief that this person is somehow holding the whole fellowship together by just sheer force of their wisdom and visibility. But here's the truth that may sting a little. They're not that important. Maybe to the pigeons they are. Maybe to the people who still need something larger than life to orbit around. But to life itself, recovery itself, the program itself, it really doesn't care. It kept moving before they got there, and it'll keep moving long after they're gone. The meeting won't collapse, the sky won't cave in, and the fellowship won't fold up like a card table just because one loud personality disappears. That's not cruelty. That's correction. That's humility. And humility is medicine in a culture addicted to self-importance. Because one of the most dangerous stores in that mall is the illusion of importance. This store has great lighting. And that one smells super expensive. That one makes people stand a little taller and talk a little slower and start believing their own legend. Addiction doesn't always come back with slurred speech and a bottle and a paper bag. Sometimes it comes back dressed in service work. Sometimes it comes back with perfect attendance and a crowd around it. Sometimes it comes back wearing a recovery slogan on a hoodie while privately feeding on recognition, control, and the need to be seen. The bottle and the bag may be gone, but the appetite for intoxication is still there. It just found a more socially acceptable bar. People, places, and things can also mean e-commerce, social media, a comment section, a dating app, a scratch-off bought at a convenience store, a political feed, a mirror, a parking lot after a meeting, a phone screen at midnight. Sometimes the place is digital. Sometimes the thing is validation. Sometimes the people are the ones applauding you while quietly doing the same dance in different shoes. This disease is creative. It's entrepreneurial. It knows how to rebrand itself. And when those substitute addictions start doing what they do, they create the same kind of sickness alcohol and drugs created before. Restlessness, secrecy, performance, denial, spiritual inflation, emotional hangovers. Suddenly, somebody is spending 2 hours getting ready for a 1-hour meeting, like recovery is Studio 54, and not a place where broken people go to stay alive. Somebody is pulling into the lot in the newest car, making sure the outside tells a story the inside can't support. Somebody is breaking their own anonymity online, not because it helps the still suffering addict. It helps feed the illusion that their healing must now be witnessed to count. And once you see that, you start to understand how all this circles right back to where we started. The marketplace of outrage. Because outrage is not separate from these things. It feeds on the same energy, the same dopamine, the same rush of being right, being seen, being loud, being central. It's one more storefront promising a hit. One more opportunity to discharge all that restless, unsurrendered energy into the public square. That's why the same people who speak beautifully about humility in one room can become absolutely feral in a comment section 6 hours later. The platform might have changed, but the wiring didn't. So no, I'm not saying this from some mountaintop. I'm saying it because I know this wiring, And I know how convincing it can be when it starts whispering that the problem is solved just because the substance is gone. The substance was never the whole story. It was just the loudest chapter. The deeper story is the mind that still wants relief, still wants applause, still wants to be important, still wants to walk through that mall and come home carrying bags it never needed. And maybe that's the real work of recovery as time goes on. Not just staying away from the first drink or the first drug, but learning to ask the harder questions, learning to stay ordinary, learning to be useful instead of important, learning that the real miracle isn't being admired for your recovery. It's not needing to be admired at all. So after looking at all of that, the marketplace of outrage, the mall of addictions, the illusion of importance, the question becomes pretty simple. What do you actually do about it? Because it's easy to point at the world and say it's crazy. It's easy to point at the internet and say it's toxic. It's easy to look at social media and say the whole thing is a circus. The truth is, the circus isn't going anywhere. The vendors are still trying to sell you something. Gambling apps, miracle supplements, political rage, quick fixes for problems that don't have quick fixes. That the whole carnival is still going to be there tomorrow, whether we like it or not. If my mind told me something would make me feel better, at one point in my life, I ran towards it like a dog chasing a tennis ball. I had absolutely no control over these impulses. Stopping drinking and using drugs didn't magically fix all that wiring. It just removed the loudest symptom. The deeper machinery was still running underneath. Because substance abuse wasn't the root of my problems. Alcohol and drugs were the fruit hanging on a tree that had roots growing much deeper into the soil. So I had to start digging into the roots of the tree, not just snapping off the branches. Before I could control my reactions, I had to understand where they were coming from. I had to take the dysfunction and start putting it back into a functional order. Because understanding the roots of the tree didn't automatically give me control over the impulses that were still firing in my brain. That's where I had to learn something else entirely. I had to learn how to control the impulse to react. Not the philosophy of it, the mechanics of it. How to control speech before words left my mouth. How to control muscles before you slam a door, fire off a message, or step into an argument you'll regret 5 minutes later. How to slow down the part of my mind that wants to react immediately. Because outrage is often nothing more than uncontrolled impulse wearing a microphone. And that's not something you can fix by just telling someone to calm down. That's like sending a newcomer into a bar and saying, hey, just don't drink. It doesn't work like that. You need tools. You need awareness. You need practice. And you need humility. The kind that admits that you're capable of making a mess of things if you stop paying attention. That's why I still make meetings every day. Not because I think I've mastered anything, but because I know what I'm capable of if I stop reminding myself. Sometimes the most powerful reminder in the room isn't the old timer with 40 years of sobriety. Sometimes it's the newcomer walking through the door looking like they just crawled out of a burning building. That's a mirror. That's a memory. That's the moment where you remember exactly how bad this disease can get. And here's how all this shows up in my life today in the most practical way possible. When I open my phone. Because if you open Facebook right now, you'll see the same thing I see every day. Ads for casino apps. No risk. Just tap here. And I know that wiring. So when one of those ads pops up on my screen, I just tap that little option that says, I don't want to see ads like this anymore. And I train that algorithm to listen. Because as much power as these platforms have, they still respond to the choices we make. That's the quiet part nobody likes to talk about. We still have agency. We still have responsibility. The world is always going to be filled with storefronts trying to sell us something. But we're still the ones deciding whether to walk in the door. That's what recovery starts to look like after a while. It's not about controlling the world. It's about controlling yourself. Making a decision not to drink or do drugs today. Making a decision today to stay away from people, places, and things that light up the wrong wiring. Making a decision today to sit in a meeting even when you don't think you need it. Because sometimes the best thing a meeting does is remind you exactly what you could become again if you stop paying attention. That's why they say meeting makers make it. Not because meetings are magic, but because reminders matter. And maybe that's where this whole conversation about the marketplace of outrage finally lands. The world is going to keep selling outrage. It's going to keep selling anger, attention, validation, and 100 other things that promise relief. That's not going to change. But recovery gives us something the marketplace can't sell: the ability to pause, the ability to step back, the ability to walk through a world full of noise and decide, I'm not buying that today. And I'm just speaking from the road less traveled in a world that's always promising a better view if you just go their way. I'm just giving you my experience in a world that's always got another storefront waiting for me to walk into.